Welcome to Mr. Sister Studio. If you're joining us for the first time, you're in a place where honesty, identity, and meaningful relationships take center stage. Subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss a new inspiring story, uploaded daily. I never thought the night my secret was exposed would become the same night my old life began to die, but that is exactly what happened. And if you have ever stood in a room with someone you loved while feeling your entire identity tremble under their gaze, then you already know the kind of silence I am talking about, the silence that is louder than screaming, the silence that makes your heartbeat sound guilty, the silence that tells you there is no more hiding left to do. Her name was Alina, and for 3 years I loved her with the kind of devotion that made me believe honesty would somehow arrive on its own if I waited long enough, as if truth were a season and not a decision. We had a small apartment with pale walls, cheap curtains, and a future we spoke about like it was already signed and sealed. We were engaged, planning a wedding, laughing over flower colors and guest lists and honeymoon ideas, and every time she looked at me and called me her steady man, her safe place, her rock, I felt both warm and ashamed, because steady was not the same as truthful, and safe was not the same as known. There was a part of me folded away in darkness, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden in the top compartment of an old suitcase at the back of the closet, a place I guarded with the intensity of someone protecting both a treasure and a crime scene. Inside that suitcase were dresses, soft blouses, stockings, delicate earrings, a compact mirror, a wig I had bought in secret 2 towns over, and a pair of white heels I had never worn outside the bedroom but had dreamed about more times than I could count. I told myself it was just stress relief at first, just fabric and feeling, just a strange comfort I didn't understand, but that was a lie I had repeated so many times it had started to sound reasonable. The truth was harder, simpler, and much more frightening. When I dressed that way, when I let myself move gently, speak softly, see that reflection looking back at me, I felt more honest than I did in my own everyday skin. I felt exposed, yes, but also real, as if the person I spent my daylight hours performing was only one version of me, and the hidden one, the one in silk and fear and trembling joy, was the version that had been waiting all along. I had no language for it then, only need, only shame, only relief. Sometimes I would wait until Alina went to visit her sister or work a late shift, then I would lock the bedroom door, open the suitcase, and transform piece by piece. Foundation to soften the angles of my face, blush to bring warmth to cheeks that always looked too stern, lipstick applied with shaking concentration, a dress zipped slowly as if each inch upward were sealing me into a truth I was not brave enough to name. I would sit at the vanity, stare into the mirror, and feel both beautiful and doomed. I never took photos. I never told anyone. I never said the thoughts out loud, because I was afraid that once spoken, they would become solid, and if they became solid, then my whole life would have to answer them. So I stayed divided. By day I was Adrian, the reliable fiancé, the man people expected, the son who never caused trouble, the groom who smiled through fittings and family dinners. By night, in stolen hours, I became someone I only dared to call her in the privacy of my own mind, someone luminous and soft and aching to breathe, someone I later came to know as Ariel. I did not plan for Alina to discover any of it. In my fantasies of confession, if I allowed myself such dangerous thoughts, it happened with tears and tenderness and maybe even understanding. She would sit with me, hold my hand, ask questions gently, tell me she still loved me even if she didn't fully understand. That was the dream version. Reality arrived on a Thursday in late autumn with rain on the windows and anger already waiting in the room before either of us knew it. I came home early from work because the office server had gone down. I remember the smell of wet concrete in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator when I entered the apartment, and the strange sensation that something was wrong before I even reached the bedroom. The closet door was open. The suitcase was on the bed, and Alina was standing beside it, holding the white heels in one hand like evidence. I stopped breathing. She turned slowly, and her face was not just confused. It was wounded. There are expressions that cut deeper than rage, because they show you exactly how your secrecy has rewritten someone else's memory. She looked at me as if every year we had spent together was shifting under her feet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted to explain everything at once, but there was too much. Too much history, too much fear, too many words that still did not know what shape they belonged in. Finally, she asked the question that sounded simple, but carried 1,000 accusations inside it. What is this? Not what are these? Not why. What is this? As if the scene before her was larger than clothing, larger than deception, larger even than me. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. She gave a brittle laugh that broke halfway through. Don't stand there and pretend you don't know, Adrian. I found the dresses, the makeup, the wig, the shoes, everything. How long has this been going on? I could have lied again. I could have called it a prank, a dare, a fetish, a phase, stress, anything smaller than the truth. Maybe part of me still wanted to. But something about being caught had stripped away the fantasy of control. I sank onto the edge of the chair and whispered, for years. Her face changed. She sat down hard on the bed, still holding the heels. Years, she repeated, like the word itself was unbelievable. Years. And you were just going to marry me without telling me. I said I was scared. She said that wasn't an answer. She was right. I said I didn't know how to explain it. She asked if I was gay. I said no, not like that, but even as I answered, I knew how clumsy and incomplete it sounded. She asked if I wanted to be a woman. I said I don't know, which was both the truest and most infuriating answer I could have given. She stared at me, and I watched disbelief harden into something crueler, not because she was cruel by nature, but because hurt people often reach for the sharpest thing they can find. So what am I to you? She asked, some cover story, some prop in your normal little performance. I told her no. I told her I loved her. I told her this part of me had nothing to do with loving her less. But she stood up before I could finish and said words I would hear in my sleep for months afterward. If you loved me, you would have trusted me with the truth before I had to find it buried in a suitcase like a dirty secret. Dirty secret. I wanted to say it wasn't dirty. I wanted to say it only became dirty in hiding. But I had no defense strong enough to survive the fact that she was right about the betrayal even if she was wrong about me. That night turned into a storm of fractured conversation. She cried, then shouted, then demanded details I could barely give. When did it start? How often? Did anyone else know? Had I gone out dressed like that? Did I want to cancel the wedding? Had I ever looked at her dress and imagined it on myself? That last question hit me with unbearable force because, yes, once, when she had shown me a photo of an ivory satin gown with a fitted waist and delicate lace sleeves, something inside me had stirred with longing so painful I nearly had to leave the room. I never told her that. I only lowered my eyes, and my silence answered for me. She recoiled as if I had stolen something sacred. You wanted my wedding dress, she said quietly, and that quietness was somehow worse than yelling. Not yours, I tried to say. Not you. Just what it meant. But language failed again. She packed a bag before midnight. I remember her folding clothes with jerking movements, wiping her face angrily, refusing to look at me. At the door she turned and said, I don't even know who you are. Then she left, and in the stillness that followed, the apartment became unrecognizable. Every object seemed to accuse me. The mug she used every morning. The blanket we had bought together. The half-finished wedding invitations on the kitchen table. I stood in the bedroom and looked at the open suitcase. For the first time in years, the hidden things were visible in full daylight, no lock, no shadows, no permission needed. I thought I would feel free. Instead, I felt wrecked. I sank to the floor and cried in a dress shirt and work slacks beside the life I had tried to keep separate from itself. But if heartbreak had ended there, perhaps this would only be a story about loss. The real unraveling began the next morning. Alina did not just leave. She told her sister. Her sister told her cousin. Her cousin told Alina's mother. By evening, my phone was exploding with calls and messages from people who had never asked me how I was, but suddenly had endless energy for judgment. Her mother called me sick. Her cousin called me deceptive. One of my own friends, after hearing a twisted version of the story through mutual circles, sent me a single text that said, "Bro, what the hell are you into?" I turned my phone off, but shame does not need a signal to keep ringing. Over the next week, the wedding collapsed in public. Vendors were canceled. Deposits were argued over. Families chose sides. Mine, predictably, chose denial until denial stopped working and gave way to outrage. My father drove over without warning, sat rigidly in my living room, and asked if the rumors were true. I said yes. He looked at the closet door, then back at me, and I saw fear in his face disguised as anger. He told me I was humiliating the family. He told me men these days had become weak. He told me that whatever confusion I was dealing with needed to be fixed quietly and quickly. I asked him fixed into what? He did not answer. He only said my mother was crying and that I should think about what I was doing to everyone. That sentence stayed with me because of its perfect cruelty. Everyone. Not me. Never me. I was the problem to be managed, the disturbance at the center of their comfort. After he left, I walked through the apartment feeling like a ghost who had somehow survived his own funeral. For several days, I barely ate. I called in sick to work. I let dishes pile up. I slept at odd hours and woke with panic already clutching my chest. Every possible future looked ruined. I had lost my fiancé, my wedding, my reputation, the image of masculinity I had been trained to protect, and still I had not gained clarity. People like to imagine revelation as a clean moment, a lightning strike of self-knowledge, but often it is slower and uglier than that. Often you become visible to others before you have become understandable to yourself. That was where I lived then, in the miserable middle, too exposed to hide, too frightened to step forward, too broken to go back. On the 6th day after Alina left, I opened the suitcase again. Not because I felt brave, because I felt empty. I needed to know whether the thing that had cost me so much still meant anything when touched by grief. I expected revulsion. I expected guilt. I expected the magic to be dead. But when I held the soft blue dress in my hands, I felt the same ache of recognition I always had, only now it was mixed with mourning. I dressed slowly, mechanically, almost like a ritual for someone who had died. When I placed the wig on my head and sat before the mirror, I saw a face swollen from crying, mascara trembling under uncertain hands, lips unsteady, posture collapsed. Yet beneath all that I saw her. Not the polished fantasy version. Not the secret escape. Someone raw and exhausted and heartbreakingly real. I looked into my own eyes and whispered, "Who are you?" In the silence that followed, another question rose up, quieter but more dangerous. Who have you been forced to pretend not to be? I stared for so long that evening faded into night. I did not receive an answer in words, but I did feel something loosen, like a knot beginning to recognize it could be untied. Over the next month, my life did not improve in any cinematic sense. It got messier. Alina officially ended the engagement. There was no dramatic reunion, no final understanding, only a short meeting at a cafe where she returned my spare key and the watch I had left at her sister's house and told me she could not build a future with someone she no longer trusted. I wanted to say I understood, but understanding felt too noble. What I felt was grief, regret, and the awful awareness that loving someone does not erase the damage of withholding yourself from them. She was not cruel that day, just tired. Before she left, she looked at me with sadness instead of anger and said, "I hope you figure out who you are because I don't think even you know yet." Then she walked out, and for the first time I let myself admit that she was right. Not as an insult, as a challenge. Figure out who you are. It sounds simple. It is not. I began with the internet, because where else do lonely people begin when they are terrified of speaking aloud? I read forums at 3 in the morning. I watched videos of people telling stories that felt too close to be coincidence. Some identified as crossdressers, some as gender fluid, some as transgender women, some as people who had spent decades hiding and then rebuilt their lives from the ashes of secrecy. Every story was different, and that difference mattered. I had spent years fearing that naming anything would trap me, but I started to understand that labels are not prisons when chosen honestly. They are maps, imperfect but useful. I booked a session with a therapist 2 neighborhoods away under a fake excuse, then almost canceled 3 times before going. Her office had warm lamps and bookshelves and a box of tissues within easy reach, which irritated me because it suggested she already knew what kind of mess would walk through her door. In the first session, I barely managed coherent sentences. I told her about the clothes, the hiding, the engagement, the discovery, the collapse. I said I didn't know whether this was only about expression or something deeper. I said I was afraid that every answer would destroy what little remained of my life. She listened without rushing to define me, and that patience itself felt revolutionary. At one point she asked, "How do you feel when you are performing masculinity for others?" I said, "Tired." She asked, "How do you feel when you present femininely in private?" I said, "Calm," then after a pause, "Alive." She nodded gently and said, "Sometimes the body tells the truth before the mind is ready to catch up." I held on to that sentence for weeks. Slowly, I built routines. I returned to work, though whispers followed me through hallways because rumors travel faster than dignity. I stopped responding to people who wanted gossip disguised as concern. I took down the engagement photo from my living room. I moved the suitcase from the closet to under the bed, then eventually to the dresser. Then finally, I unpacked it completely. That mattered more than it sounds. Hidden objects create hidden selves. Open drawers change something in the air. On evenings when the loneliness was worst, I dressed not to escape, but to sit with myself honestly. I practiced makeup without panic. I learned how to walk in heels without clutching furniture. I bought a proper mirror. I started writing in a journal, and without planning to, I began signing some entries with the name Ariel. The first time I did it, my hand shook. The second time it felt less like invention and more like recognition. Months passed. Winter sharpened into a cold that seemed to make every reflection more severe. Then one Saturday, on a dare issued by the bravest and gentlest part of myself, I left the apartment dressed as Ariel for the first time. It was not glamorous. It was terrifying. I chose a simple burgundy sweater dress, black tights, ankle boots with a modest heel, a coat long enough to make me feel less visible, and light makeup that I knew would fool no one but helped me feel assembled. I stood in the hallway outside my door for almost a full minute trying to convince my lungs to work. The world beyond that stairwell felt like a jury. When I finally stepped outside, the sky was gray and the air smelled like rain. Every passing car seemed too loud. Every stranger seemed to know. I walked 3 blocks to a small cafe across from a florist shop because I had memorized from online reviews that it was quiet, queer-friendly, and had a back corner where no one bothered anyone. The bell over the cafe door chimed, and I nearly turned around. But a barista with green eyeliner and a bored kindness simply looked up and asked, "What can I get you?" No double take. No sneer. No scene. Just coffee. I ordered in a voice that shook on the first word and steadied by the second. When she asked for my name, there was a moment, tiny and enormous. I could say Adrian and retreat. Or I could step 1 inch closer to myself. "Ariel," I said. She wrote it on the cup without hesitation. I sat in the corner, wrapped both hands around the warmth, and stared at that name like it had been handed down from another life. I wish I could tell you that one outing healed everything, but healing is rarely that dramatic. Still, something irreversible happened in that cafe. The sky did not fall. No one dragged me back into shame. My body, which had spent years preparing for disaster, experienced a quiet hour of existence instead. Sometimes survival begins there, not with applause, but with the simple absence of punishment. After that I returned, first once a month, then once a week. Eventually the barista, whose name was June, recognized me and treated Ariel as ordinary, which to me felt miraculous. One evening when the place was nearly empty and I had gathered enough courage to hold eye contact, June leaned on the counter and said, "You look less scared every time you come in." I laughed nervously and said that was because I was an excellent actress. She smiled and said, "Or maybe because this is closer to you than whatever you're pretending to be out there." It startled me how easily some people could see what I had spent years burying. June became my first real friend after the collapse. Not because we instantly shared everything, but because she let me arrive at honesty in my own time. Through her, I met others. A small group of women and queer folks who gathered after hours on Thursdays, drinking tea, complaining about work, exchanging beauty tips, laughing too loudly, and speaking about gender as if complexity were survivable. The first night I joined them, I sat stiff and silent, afraid I would say the wrong thing and be revealed as an imposter in every direction. Too feminine for one world, not feminine enough for another. But community has a way of dissolving the lies isolation writes. There was Nina, a trans woman with a laugh like breaking glass and sunlight, who told me she had lost half her family and found the other half in chosen people. There was Marisol, who said clothing had saved her life because style gave language to feelings she could not otherwise name. There was Theo, who shifted between masculine and feminine presentation with such ease that I initially mistook it for confidence, only to learn it had been earned through years of terror. They did not demand I define myself on schedule. They only asked me to tell the truth when I could. So I did in fragments. I talked about Alina, about the suitcase, about the fear that maybe I had destroyed my old life without deserving a new one. Nina listened, then said, most of us were taught to treat authenticity like selfishness. That's why we wait until pain becomes unbearable. You didn't betray people by existing. You betrayed yourself by hiding. The rest is fallout. That sentence cut through me with almost surgical precision. Betrayal had been the word haunting my story from the beginning. I had betrayed Alina's trust, yes. But I had also betrayed my own reflection for years, offering it only secrecy, apology, and scraps of time. Understanding that did not erase the hurt I had caused. It did, however, make it impossible to keep punishing myself as though self-erasure were moral. Spring came gradually, and with it came movement. I changed therapists because my first one moved away, and the second therapist, Dr. Singh, was even more direct in ways I needed. One afternoon, after months of conversations circling the same truth, she asked, when you imagine growing old, which life lets you breathe? The one where Adrian survives by performance, or the one where Ariel exists fully and risks everything? I could not answer immediately. So she said, don't answer with fear. Answer with longing. And there it was. Longing. That had always been the truest compass. Not certainty, not labels, not what would be easiest for my family or least embarrassing to old friends. Longing. When I imagined myself decades from now, I did not see peace as a man secretly borrowing womanhood in darkness. I saw grief for lost time. I saw resentment. I saw a permanent dimming. But when I imagined a life where Ariel could stand in daylight, even with hardship, even with rejection, even with all the terrifying unknowns, I felt something open in my chest that had no relation to fantasy. It felt like oxygen. That was the first day I allowed myself to say, quietly, privately, I think I might be a woman. Even writing the thought in my journal made my pulse race. I repeated it for weeks, testing it, not as performance but as a prayer. I think I might be a woman. Eventually it shifted. I am a woman, though I am still learning how to live as one. There is no applause when that sentence finally lands inside you. Only relief and fear sitting side by side like reluctant sisters. Coming out to my family was worse than I expected and better than I feared, which is to say it was a disaster that did not kill me. My mother cried before I finished. My father refused to use my name and told me I was throwing my life away for confusion. My younger cousin, unexpectedly, squeezed my hand under the table and later texted me that she was proud of my honesty. My sister, who had always watched more carefully than she spoke, called me 2 nights later and said, I think part of me knew you were hurting long before I knew why. Tell me what you need. Sometimes grace arrives from the quietest direction. I did not win everyone over. Some relatives stopped inviting me to gatherings. Some spoke about me as if I were dead. One uncle insisted on introducing me with the wrong pronouns at a family ceremony until I left halfway through dessert and cried in the parking lot. But others changed slowly. My mother, after months of stumbling through denial and shame, called one evening and asked in a trembling voice if Ariel was the name I wanted her to use. I said yes. She practiced it like a fragile object. She did not get everything right after that, not even close. But that moment mattered because it was the first time someone from my old world chose to reach for me instead of dragging me backward. Work became impossible after a while. The rumors never fully died, and when I began presenting more consistently as feminine outside office hours, I could feel the scrutiny sharpening. Promotions dried up. Small humiliations multiplied. My manager once said in a meeting that I needed to be careful not to make clients uncomfortable, and though the sentence was wrapped in professionalism, I knew exactly what he meant. So I left. People called it impulsive, but sometimes staying in a place built around your shrinking is the true recklessness. I took freelance design jobs from home, cut my expenses down brutally, and started rebuilding life in ways that gave me room to become visible. I practiced voice training. I learned skincare. I watched tutorials on everything from eyebrow shaping to posture to legal name changes. I stumbled. I made terrible makeup choices. I bought dresses that looked incredible online and absurd in real life. I had nights of euphoria so intense I danced alone in my apartment, and nights of dysphoria so heavy I could not stand my own reflection. But even on the worst nights, I knew something fundamental had changed. The pain was no longer the pain of suppression. It was the pain of becoming, and becoming at least moves. About a year after the engagement ended, I received a message from Alina. Just my name on the screen made my stomach tighten. She asked if we could meet. I almost refused. Not out of anger, but because I was afraid of what version of myself might collapse in front of her. Still, some stories do not fully close until both people stand inside the ruins and admit what was lost. We met in a quiet park lined with jacaranda trees in bloom, purple petals scattered along the paths like bruised confetti. She looked older, softer somehow, less sharp at the edges. So did I, though in an entirely different way. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You look happy." I laughed because happiness was too neat a word for the life I had. Hard won, uneven, bright and painful. But yes, maybe happiness lived there now in pieces. We walked slowly. She told me she had been angry for a long time, then embarrassed by how much of that anger had curdled into gossip through her family, even when she had not intended for it to spread so far. She said she had wanted someone to blame, because grief is easier when it has a target. I told her I understood. Then I apologized, fully this time, not for who I was, but for the secrecy, for the cowardice, for asking her to commit to a version of me that was already cracking apart. Tears filled her eyes, and for a second I saw the woman I had once planned a future with, the woman who had not been my villain, only another casualty of my fear. She asked if I was Ariel all the time now. I said mostly yes. She asked if I was transitioning. I said yes, in the ways that felt right for me, slowly, honestly. She nodded. Then she said something I did not expect, and perhaps will never forget. I don't think I lost you because you were becoming yourself. I think I lost you because you were trying so hard not to be. There are truths that arrive too late to repair the past but still manage to redeem it slightly by making it understandable. That was one of them. We did not get back together. We were not supposed to. Some loves are real and still not meant to survive the truth they were built without. But we parted with gentleness that day, and the bitterness I had carried for months loosened at last. Time continued its patient work. My legal documents changed. Seeing Ariel printed on official forms made me cry in grocery store parking lots and clinic waiting rooms, and once in the middle of a bank because recognition can be overwhelming when you have spent so long being administratively erased. My apartment changed too. I painted the bedroom walls a soft warm cream, replaced the harsh overhead light with lamps that made evening feel kinder, and hung a full-length mirror not as an instrument of judgment, but as a witness. I learned to host friends. I learned how good it feels when laughter fills rooms that used to know only hiding. June brought flowers once and said, "Every woman deserves a home that looks like she lives in it." I think about that often. A home that looks like she lives in it. For years I had inhabited my own life like an intruder, careful not to leave traces. Now traces were everywhere. Perfume on the dresser. Hair ties on the bathroom sink. lipstick in my handbag, shoes by the door. Not props, not secrets. Evidence of a life actually inhabited. And yes, there was still pain. Dating was a minefield of fetishization, ignorance, and occasional cruelty. Strangers online could be vile in inventive ways. There were days when my voice betrayed me, or my shoulders seemed too broad, or old photographs surfaced from relatives who refused to let Adrian rest in peace. There were doctor appointments full of bureaucracy and questions that made my body feel like a debate. There were mornings when I missed the simplicity of being legible, even if that legibility had been false. But the difference was this: I no longer mistook simplicity for peace. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of alignment. The title of this story says From Reluctant Groom to Radiant Bride, and maybe you've been waiting for the bride part, wondering how such a phrase could belong to someone whose engagement exploded before the wedding even happened. The answer is both literal and symbolic, because the strangest twist in all of this came 2 years after my old life fell apart. Nina, the same friend who once told me authenticity is not selfishness, proposed a wild idea after too much wine and late-night honesty. She said, "You know what you need? A bridal shoot." At first I laughed so hard I nearly choked. A bridal shoot felt absurd, theatrical, indulgent, impossible. Then I went quiet, because beneath the absurdity was a longing so old I could barely touch it. The bridal image had haunted me for years, first through Alina's wedding plans, then through secret mirror fantasies, then through grief, shame, and impossible desire. Not because I wanted to steal anyone else's role, because somewhere deep inside, bride had become shorthand for visibility, softness, ceremony, and being chosen not as a disguise but as a truth. Nina saw my silence and grinned. "Exactly," she said. "We're doing it." And somehow, with the stubborn love of chosen family, it happened. June did my makeup with such care, I nearly cried before we even started. Marisol found a gown from a consignment boutique, ivory with a flowing skirt and lace bodice that made my hands shake the moment I touched it. Theo brought champagne and ridiculous encouragement. We rented a small studio with sunlight pouring through tall windows. When I stepped into that dress, no audience, no groom, no church, no deception, just me and the women who had helped gather my scattered pieces, I felt something old and broken inside me finally exhale. They buttoned me in, adjusted the hem, fixed the veil, and turned me toward the mirror. I had imagined that moment for years, but imagination had never prepared me for the stillness that settled over me when I saw myself there, not pretending, not borrowing, not hiding, simply present. Radiant is a dangerous word because it sounds too easy, too polished, too triumphant. But what I saw in that mirror was not perfection. It was survival made visible. Every secret, every loss, every night on the bathroom floor, every cruel message, every brave little step to the cafe, every therapy session, every trembling conversation, every goodbye, every inch of becoming was there in that reflection. I put a hand over my mouth and cried so hard June had to hold my shoulders so my makeup would not be ruined. Nina laughed and cried too and said, "Look at you, bride." And for once the word did not cut. It healed. The photographs from that day remain some of the most precious things I own, not because they prove beauty, but because they prove arrival. When I look at them now, I do not see a man dressed up. I do not see shame wearing lace. I see a woman who crossed fire to meet herself. A woman who learned that betrayal can break you. Yes, but it can also force every hidden fracture into daylight where healing, finally, becomes possible. If you are listening to my story and thinking about your own secrets, your own hidden drawers, your own private mirror moments, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me earlier. Hiding may protect you from immediate loss, but it also teaches you to treat your soul like contraband. And eventually that cost becomes unbearable. Trust is fragile, yes. I learned that in the worst possible way. But self-discovery is powerful because it asks a harder question than who hurt you. It asks what part of yourself you are still abandoning just to keep others comfortable. I was a reluctant groom because the role had been handed to me before I ever asked whether it fit. I became a radiant bride not because someone transformed me against my will, but because truth kept tapping at the walls of my life until I finally opened the door. No one saw it coming, not Alina, not my family, not the people who thought they knew me, not even me in my most frightened years. But maybe that is how real transformation works. It does not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it begins as discomfort, then secrecy, then collapse, then grief, then one small act of courage repeated until a whole new life exists where a hidden suitcase once did. And if you have ever been broken by the person who found your truth before you were ready to share it, if you have ever watched your old life burn and wondered whether anything beautiful could possibly rise from the ashes, let me be your answer. Yes. Yes, something beautiful can rise. Not untouched, not uncomplicated, but real. And real is worth more than perfect ever was. So this is my story. From the silence of locked doors to the light of open windows, from the fear of being seen to the grace of finally seeing myself, from reluctant groom to radiant bride. And if there is one truth I leave with you tonight, let it be this. The transformation no one saw coming was never about becoming someone else. It was about finally refusing to disappear. And even after that day, even after the veil, the photographs, the trembling joy, and the feeling that some impossible circle inside me had finally closed, life did not suddenly become a fairy tale where pain vanished and every wound turned decorative. In some ways, becoming visible made life harder before it made it softer, because once you stop hiding, the world no longer has to guess what to attack. I learned that truth in grocery stores and government offices, in family gatherings and online comment sections, in the subtle violence of people staring too long, and the more direct violence of words dropped like stones by strangers who believed their confusion gave them ownership over my existence. But I also learned another truth that was stronger than that one. Once you have met yourself for real, once you have looked into the mirror and recognized not a fantasy, but a person whose survival depends on honesty, it becomes much harder to go back to living as a performance. I tried once or twice in small ways. There were days I dressed down, flattened myself, lowered my voice, returned to more neutral clothes, told myself I was only being practical, only protecting my peace, only managing the world's reactions. But each time I did it for too long, I felt that old deadness creeping in, the old sensation of watching my life from several feet away, like I was seated in the audience while someone else stood on stage wearing my face. It was incredible how quickly I had once accepted that numbness as normal, and equally incredible how impossible it became once I knew there was another way to live. So, I chose discomfort over disappearance. That became one of the quiet laws of my new life. Not because I enjoyed suffering, but because I had already spent too many years paying for other people's comfort with my own silence. The bridal shoot changed something practical too. Until then, Ariel had still lived partly in private ritual and partly in cautious public steps, but after seeing myself that fully, that openly, I could not pretend anymore that womanhood was an occasional expression for me. It was not a costume and not a temporary release valve, and not a hobby hidden behind shut doors. It was a life asking to be lived all the way through. So I started making choices that reflected that truth more steadily. I changed my wardrobe completely, which sounds superficial to people who do not understand what clothing can mean, but for me it was not about fashion first. It was about coherence. I donated old shirts I had once worn to job interviews and family dinners and dreadful celebrations where I smiled through suffocation. I kept a few practical things, but most of what belonged to Adrian left in bags stacked by the door. In their place came skirts, blouses, fitted jeans, winter coats that draped instead of boxed, soft sweaters in colors I had never allowed myself to touch before, shoes chosen not for how much space they claimed, but for how they carried me through it. I learned slowly what suited me and what did not. I discovered that I loved cream and rose and deep emerald, that high necklines made me feel too constrained, that a well-cut wrap dress could rescue an entire week, that some mornings the smallest thing, a pair of earrings catching the light just right, could keep me from sliding into despair. There is a kind of education that happens in womanhood for those of us who arrive late to it, and it is both tender and brutal. We learn in public what others were permitted to practice in private youth. We learn by failing, by smudged mascara, by awkward posture, by voices that crack under pressure, by old instincts toward self-erasure colliding with new hunger for beauty. Each lesson cost me something, but each lesson also returned something I had never been given the chance to own. I remember the first time I went shopping alone for bras, how ridiculous and terrified I felt standing under fluorescent lights pretending to browse calmly while my heart beat itself sick. The saleswoman who approached me was middle-aged, elegant in a soft gray blouse, and she asked with gentle professionalism if I needed help. I froze for half a second too long, then admitted yes in a voice so small I almost did not hear myself. She did not laugh. She did not stare. She measured me, brought options, explained straps and cups, and fit with the same matter-of-fact care she would have offered anyone else. I nearly cried in the fitting room, not because the experience was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary had become one of the most precious things in the world to me. Not spectacle, not tolerance dressed up as praise. Just ordinariness. Being helped, being seen, being included in the ordinary rituals of womanhood that so many people take for granted. Later I would feel that same ache of gratitude the first time a waitress called me ma'am without hesitation, the first time a receptionist asked for Ariel and meant me, the first time a friend texted me asking which heels went better with her dress, as though my femininity were no longer a secret to decode, but simply part of the social fabric between us. These were not huge victories from the outside. But when your life has been shaped by fear of exposure, the smallest confirmations can feel like a cathedral opening inside your chest. Still, joy did not arrive without tests. One summer afternoon, I received an invitation to my cousin Elena's wedding. She was one of the few relatives who had stayed kind to me after everything with Elena, and she wrote my chosen name neatly on the envelope, which mattered more than she knew. But beneath the sweetness of being invited was a fresh terror. Weddings had once been the site of my deepest contradictions. They were where gender roles hardened, where families performed tradition, where brides were adored and grooms were fortified, where everything I had once feared and desired existed in heightened ritual. I did not know if I could attend without collapsing under the weight of what it would stir. I almost declined. Then Elena called and said, "If you come as yourself. I want you there, not an apology version of you." So I went. I wore a lilac dress with long sleeves, understated jewelry, hair softly pinned back, makeup delicate enough to feel elegant rather than armored. When I arrived at the venue, a garden wrapped in late sunlight and white roses, the old ghosts came rushing in all at once. For a moment I saw not the present wedding but the wreckage of the one that never happened. The engagement ring returned in a cafe, the accusation in Elena's eyes, the bridal fantasies I had buried like contraband. My knees nearly buckled. I went to the restroom, stared into the mirror, and whispered to myself, "You are not here to mourn what failed. You are here to witness love and remain real while doing it." It sounds simple now, but in that moment, it was a lifeline. I stepped back out. Elena saw me from across the room, lifted her skirt with one hand, and ran over. She hugged me so tightly I laughed in surprise. Then she pulled back, looked me over with theatrical approval, and said, "You look gorgeous, cousin." No hesitation. No footnote. Just gorgeous. I spent the evening dancing with aunties who had once barely looked at me, chatting with younger relatives who adapted faster than their parents, and sitting under string lights with my sister while she told me half-scandalous stories about the groom's family. At one point, while the bride and groom were cutting the cake, I caught my reflection faintly in the window glass, softened by candlelight and distance, and I felt something extraordinary. Not envy, not longing sharpened into pain, just presence. I was no longer the hidden watcher aching for permission to enter the scene. I was in the scene. My own life had finally admitted me. That night taught me that healing is not when old triggers vanish. Healing is when they visit and no longer own the room. Of course, not every family event ended so gracefully. A few months later, at a funeral, an older relative loudly referred to me by my dead name in front of a cluster of people I had not seen in years. It was deliberate. I knew it from the satisfaction in his face, the way he paused afterward as if waiting to see whether I would flinch. In the past, I would have frozen, swallowed the hurt, let the moment pass to avoid causing a scene. But grief and growth had changed my tolerance for humiliation. I looked him directly in the eye and said, "My name is Ariel." Calmly, clearly, no apology tucked inside it. The room went quiet for half a second. He smirked and muttered something about everyone being too sensitive these days. Then my mother, who once could barely say my name on the phone, stepped forward and said, "She told you her name. Use it." I cannot describe to you what that felt like. Not because the moment was perfect, not because all was redeemed, but because love, real love, had started to evolve inside people I had nearly given up on. My mother and I still had difficult conversations, still stumbled over history, still carried mutual bruises from the years of silence and misunderstanding. But that day she chose me publicly, and that choice stitched something together that had been torn for so long I no longer believed repair was possible. Later, in the car, she did not look at me when she spoke. She kept her eyes on the windshield and said, "I don't understand everything, but I know what cruelty looks like, and I won't stand there while someone does that to my child." I turned my face toward the window because if I had looked at her directly, I would have sobbed. Sometimes reconciliation does not begin with comprehension. Sometimes it begins with protection. And protection, when offered at last, can grow into understanding with time. My father took longer. Much longer. Years, really. Our conversations were stiff, infrequent, and full of absences where affection should have lived. He avoided my pronouns by avoiding whole sentences. He sent money once when my freelance work hit a bad stretch, then acted irritated when I thanked him. He asked my sister whether I was safe but never asked me directly. It would be easy to turn him into a simple villain, and in some chapters of my life I did. But age, pain, and honesty complicate people. He had grown up inside a narrow vision of manhood that had bruised him too, though differently. I began to understand that my transition did not only unsettle his idea of me. It exposed the fragility of the script he had obeyed all his life. Around him, I was a walking challenge to the belief that gender conformity guarantees peace. It clearly had not given him peace. It had given him rigidity, silence, and a family he did not know how to love without control. That realization did not excuse the hurt he caused, but it helped me stop waiting for him to become the father I needed him to be in the language I preferred. One winter evening, long after sunset, he called unexpectedly. His voice was rough, smaller than usual. He said his blood pressure had been bad, and the doctor wanted him to change his habits. He talked for 10 full minutes about medication, diet, headaches, work stress. Ordinary things. Then, just before hanging up, he said, "Are you taking care of yourself?" He did not say daughter. He did not say son. He did not say Ariel. But he asked me directly. For him, that was a crack in the wall. I said yes. He grunted softly and said good. It was not enough, but it was something. And in families like mine, something can be the first honest currency. While these quiet domestic wars unfolded, my outside world kept expanding. Freelance work eventually brought me into contact with a small production company run by two women who valued creativity more than conformity and deadlines more than appearance, which is sometimes the nearest thing to liberation the professional world can offer. I designed promotional materials, storyboards, social graphics, campaign visuals. The work was unstable but strangely nourishing because it let me build things that could be seen, and being paid to create visible beauty after a lifetime of hiding became its own private joke with the universe. Through that company, I met Leora, a documentary editor with an unruly bun, brilliant eyes, and a habit of speaking as if she had already decided honesty was more merciful than politeness. We became friends gradually, through coffee runs and late-night revisions and shared irritation at clients who thought inspiration should cost less than ignorance. She knew I was trans from the beginning. It was not a confession by then, just part of my biography the way anyone has one. One night, after a brutal deadline, we sat on the office floor eating stale cake from a wrapped shoot and talking about nothing important until it turned, as conversations often do when exhaustion lowers the defenses, toward the things that actually matter. She asked if I had ever been in love after Alina. I said no, not really, unless you count brief disasters and digital disappointments. She laughed and said she was asking because she had been trying not to flirt with me for 3 months and was tired of her own restraint. Reader, listener, whoever you are at this point in my story, I wish I had looked elegant in that moment. I did not. I inhaled cake crumbs and nearly died. She thumped me on the back while laughing so hard she cried. Nothing in me had prepared for desire arriving without mockery, without fetish, without the disorienting sense that I was someone's curiosity project. Leora liked me in a way that felt both startling and deeply calm, as though she had simply noticed what was there and chosen not to look away. Our first date was at a bookstore cafe, where she bought me tea before I could argue, and then listened so attentively while I rambled about design, family, bridal symbolism, voice training, and why certain perfumes make me feel more anchored in my body that I kept waiting for the hidden punchline. There wasn't one. She just liked me. Not the performance of me. Not the tragedy of me. Me. It took months for my nervous system to believe that. Loving after betrayal is its own kind of transition. You have to retrain yourself to understand that vulnerability is not the same as impending harm. You have to let old alarms ring without obeying them every time. With Leora, I learned how to be honest before being cornered into honesty. I told her when dysphoria made intimacy difficult. I told her when family events unraveled me for days afterward. I told her about the suitcase, the exposure, Alina, the bridal shoot, the fear that some part of me would always expect abandonment when love got too close. She did not rush to soothe me with cliches. She did not say you're overthinking or that was the past. She said, that makes sense and I'm still here. It turns out consistency is one of the most erotic and healing things in the world when you have spent your life bracing for the opposite. She met June and Nina and Theo. She came to Thursday tea nights and survived the questioning, which was more intense than any formal interrogation because chosen family cares in invasive, glitter-coated ways. She fit. Not because everyone instantly loved her, though some did, but because she respected the ecosystem of love that had kept me alive long enough to meet her. There is a difference between entering someone's life and understanding what built it. She understood. Months later, when we took a weekend trip to the coast, I stood barefoot at the edge of the sea in a white sundress with wind whipping my hair into chaos, and she snapped a candid photo of me laughing at something I can no longer remember. When I saw the picture later, I cried. Not because I looked perfect. I didn't. My hair was wild, my face mid-laughter, my posture gloriously unposed. I cried because I looked free. Freedom, I discovered, is sometimes easier to recognize in photographs than in the moment itself. Around that time, almost by accident, I started telling my story online. It began small. June had teased for months that with all the intensity in my journals, I should either write a book or start a channel. I laughed it off. But one rainy night, while reorganizing my room, I found the old bridal shoot photos and one short video clip Theo had taken of me seeing myself in the veil for the first time. I watched it over and over. There I was, hands trembling, eyes widening, one breath away from tears. It was such a private moment, such a sacred one, and yet I knew there were people out there sitting alone in bedrooms and bathrooms and quiet apartments, just as I once had, convinced their longing made them monstrous or ridiculous. I remembered how desperately I had needed stories when I had none. So I made a video. No fancy lighting, no professional setup, just me in a soft pink blouse in front of my bedroom lamp, speaking directly into the camera. I talked about secrecy, about gender, about losing a fiancé, and finding myself, about bridal imagery, and what it had meant to me, about the difference between performance and truth. I expected maybe a few dozen views. Instead, it spread far wider than I was ready for. Messages poured in from people across cities and countries I had never visited. Some were from trans women in their 50s who wrote that they had never said any of this out loud until hearing me. Some were from younger people terrified of being discovered. Some were from wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers trying to understand the person in their life who had been hiding. Some were painful. Some were beautiful. All of them reminded me that stories do not stay where you place them. Once spoken, they begin building bridges you may never walk across yourself. That is how feminized bride tales began. Though at first the name was just a placeholder, I found half amusing and half true. It was not supposed to become anything serious. But the more I spoke, the more I realized I was creating the thing I had once needed most. A space where femininity, transformation, shame, longing, betrayal, and self-discovery could exist together without being flattened into punchlines or pathology. People came not only for glamour or fantasy, though some did, but for the emotional underbelly of becoming, for the stories that lived behind the lipstick and lace. I told tales from my life and stories inspired by others who wrote to me, always protecting identities, always centering feeling over spectacle. The comments could be chaotic, yes, but many were deeply moving. One person wrote, "I listened in my car outside my house because I'm not ready for my family to know, and for the first time I didn't hate myself afterward." Another wrote, "I'm the ex-wife in this story, not the bride, and your honesty helped me grieve without turning cruel." That one shook me. Pain reflects in so many directions. The channel grew, not explosively at first, but steadily, like a candle lighting others. I learned about microphones and editing software and viewer retention and thumbnails and the bizarre economy of online intimacy. I learned how to speak in ways that invited people in without bleeding out for them. That balance took time. There is a temptation, when your wound becomes your work, to keep reopening it because pain looks authentic under bright lights. I had to learn that not all disclosure is healing, and not every audience deserves every chapter. Still, there was power in transforming what once nearly destroyed me into something that could comfort others. It felt less like monetizing trauma and more like composting it, turning rot into something that could nourish life elsewhere. Of course, visibility online brought ugliness too. There were hateful messages, lurid questions, people demanding explicit details as if transness only became real to them when sexualized. There were accusations from strangers who thought womanhood could be audited and revoked, and others who praised me so theatrically it felt like another form of dehumanization, as if I were brave only because they had never imagined someone like me as ordinary. I learned to block, delete, disengage. I learned that boundaries are not failures of compassion. I learned that some people do not come to understand. They come to consume, provoke, or confirm their own prejudices. Let them go. But among the noise, there were real connections. That made the work worth it. One evening during a live session, someone asked me whether I ever regretted losing the life I had before. The question caught me because regret is not a single thing. I regret hurting Alina through silence. I regret the years I spent making my own reflection beg for scraps. I regret the nights of panic, the family fractures, the way fear made me smaller than I needed to be. But do I regret not remaining Adrian forever, not marrying in borrowed masculinity, not building a life on secrecy and performance? No. I grieve that version of possibility sometimes, because we mourn even the futures that would have suffocated us. But grief is not the same as regret. I answered the person honestly. I said, I miss what I thought that life could have been, but I do not miss who I had to become to stay inside it. The chat went quiet for a few seconds, then the messages flooded in. Same, someone wrote. That's it, another said. I copied my own sentence later into a notebook because sometimes the truest words arrive while speaking to others. And then they turn around and reveal you to yourself again. As feminized bride tales grew, people began asking for more than stories. They asked for guidance. How do I start if I'm terrified? What if my spouse finds out? How do I know if I'm just crossdressing or something deeper? What if I'm too old? What if I'm not feminine enough? What if I lose everything? I never wanted to become one of those voices online pretending to possess universal answers, because gender is too intimate and too varied for that kind of arrogance. So I spoke carefully. I said there are questions no one else can answer for you, but there are also fears designed to keep you from asking them honestly. I said start with gentleness rather than spectacle. I said notice where you feel alive, where you feel numb, where your body relaxes, where your longing returns no matter how often you shame it. I said truth rarely arrives as a perfect sentence. It more often gathers through repetition, through ache, through the things you cannot stop returning to when no one is watching. That last line seemed to matter to many people. It mattered to me too. If I had understood that earlier, maybe I would have recognized that my secret was not a random obsession but a persistent language my soul kept using because all the easier languages had failed. Another unexpected chapter began when a small queer community center reached out and asked if I would speak at a panel on gender journeys and self-reinvention. Public speaking had once terrified me enough to make my palms sweat for days beforehand. But by then I had spent so many hours talking to a camera that the idea felt less impossible. I said yes. The panel took place in a modest room with folding chairs, paper cups of weak coffee, rainbow flyers taped slightly crooked to the walls, and about 60 people ranging from teens to retirees. I wore a navy dress and a pearl pendant Leora had given me on my birthday. When my turn came, I expected to be formal. Instead, I found myself speaking with a kind of unguarded clarity I had never reached before. I said that transformation is often romanticized as a sudden glow-up, a before and after montage, a beautiful reveal. But the truth is that most real transformation looks like grief first. It looks like losing the life that no longer fits before the next one feels fully yours. It looks like disappointing people who only knew how to love your mask. It looks like awkwardness, bureaucracy, shame attacks, mirror fights, tiny joys, chosen family, and 100 acts of courage, so small they barely count as courage until one day you notice they have built a new life around you. Afterward, an older woman approached me, elegant and trembling, probably in her late 60s. She said her spouse had recently come out after 40 years of marriage, and she had arrived at the panel feeling betrayed and furious. Then she said, hearing you talk about secrecy as survival and not just deception changed something in me. Not everything, but something. I held her hands while she cried. That moment stayed with me because it reminded me again that stories do not only heal the people who identify directly with them. They can also soften the hearts of those standing on the other side of the wound. As my confidence grew, so did my ambition. I began writing longer scripts, blending lived experience with emotional storytelling, weaving in themes of femininity, ceremony, shame, devotion, and the sacredness of self-recognition. My audience responded most intensely to the stories where bridal symbolism was not just aesthetic but psychological, where the bride represented arrival, vulnerability, chosen visibility, and the right to be seen as precious rather than hidden. That made sense to me because for many of us, especially those taught to fear our own femininity, the image of the bride is not merely about marriage. It is about centrality, about being looked at and not punished, about softness elevated instead of mocked, about walking into a room not as an embarrassment, but as the focus of reverence. No wonder that symbol had haunted me for so long. I started exploring it more consciously, not as theft from cis women, as some cruel critics accused, but as an emotional architecture many of us can recognize in our own ways. The response was extraordinary. People wrote essays in the comments. They told me about childhood memories of veils made from bedsheets, a fascination with wedding magazines they could not explain, of wanting not only romance, but a certain kind of permitted beauty. The more I spoke, the more I understood that what I had once thought was my strangest private contradiction was actually part of a much larger human longing, the longing to be welcomed into your own reflection with ceremony instead of shame. Around the third year of the channel, a publisher of niche memoir anthologies contacted me about contributing an essay. I laughed at first, certain it was spam. It wasn't. They had watched my videos, read transcripts, and believed there was a readership for a written piece on bridal symbolism in gender self-discovery. I nearly said no out of old imposter habits. Then I remembered how many times my life had changed because I said yes while still shaking. So I wrote it. The essay was part memoir, part meditation, part love letter to the frightened selves people hide because they believe no language exists for them. Writing it forced me back through painful terrain with more discipline than spontaneous storytelling ever had. On the page, I had to name things cleanly. The suitcase, the silence, the engagement, Alina's discovery, my family, the bridal shoot. The first moment I understood that wanting to be seen beautifully was not narcissism or delusion, but a hunger for congruence. When the essay was published, I received messages from readers who had no prior connection to my channel, people who found it through literary circles or community newsletters or sheer accident. One woman wrote that she had clipped a line from the essay and taped it beside her mirror. The line was this: "Shame teaches us to approach our own reflection like trespassers, but healing begins when we enter as rightful inhabitants." I had forgotten I wrote that until she quoted it back to me. I sat there stunned, realizing again that sometimes the words we offer others become rooms they live in. Life with Leora deepened in ways that were both ordinary and miraculous. We fought sometimes over dishes, deadlines, emotional timing, the familiar domestic foolishness that proves love has crossed from fantasy into daily life. She saw me through hormone fluctuations, bad medical appointments, panic spirals before family events, euphoric shopping trips, makeup disasters, late-night script obsession, and the strange half-fame of being recognizable in certain corners of the internet. She never treated my transition as a permanent emergency, which was one of the greatest gifts she gave me. She honored its seriousness without making it the only story about me. I was not just a trans woman to her. I was annoying when hungry, stubborn when stressed, sentimental about perfumes, strangely competitive about playlists, capable of crying over fabric textures, obsessed with curtains, excellent at visual composition, terrible at remembering where I put my keys, and deeply, embarrassingly in love with ceremonial details. Being known in those dimensions felt richer than any single label, because true love does not flatten complexity into a headline. One autumn, during a weekend away in a renovated countryside inn, she asked me whether I ever wanted some kind of ceremony for myself, not necessarily a wedding, just something that honored how far I had come. The question wrecked me because I had wanted that for years without daring to speak it aloud. A ritual, a marker, something between mourning and celebration. Something that said this life counts, this becoming counts, this woman is not an accident. So we planned one. Not immediately and not extravagantly, but with care. We invited a small group, my sister, June, Nina, Theo, Marisol, a few others who had become essential threads in my life. My mother came too, hesitantly but sincerely. We held the ceremony in a botanical garden at twilight. There were no vows to a partner in the traditional sense, though Leora spoke, and so did I. The ceremony was about witness, about transition, about choosing life in truth. I wore a soft ivory gown, simpler than a wedding dress, but undeniably bridal in spirit, because by then I no longer believed I had to justify the symbolism that healed me. June pinned small white flowers into my hair. My sister cried before the ceremony even began. Nina officiated with exactly the right blend of irreverence and tenderness. She said we were gathered to witness not a fantasy, but a reclamation, not a costume, but a consecration of truth, not the beginning of worth, but the public honoring of a worth that had survived concealment, betrayal, and fear. I thought I would hold myself together. I did not. When it came time for me to speak, I looked at the people in front of me, the ones who had seen me as hidden, breaking, emerging, stumbling, shining, and I nearly lost my voice. But then I remembered every frightened version of myself who had once believed this kind of moment belonged only to other people, and I knew I had to speak for her too. So I said that there was a time when I thought being chosen was the highest form of love, chosen by a partner, chosen by a family, chosen by society as acceptable and legible and worthy of ceremony. But now I knew something greater. There is a form of love that begins when you choose not to abandon yourself, even when others do not yet understand who you are. There is a holiness in staying. There is grace in becoming. There is dignity in refusing to disappear. When I finished, my mother was crying openly. Later she told me it was the first time she fully grasped that my transition had not been rebellion against the family. It had been rescue of the self. That ceremony remains one of the brightest nights of my life. Not because it erased the past, but because it gathered every broken piece and said, "You belong to the same story after all." Afterward, the channel changed again. My storytelling became less haunted by the need to prove legitimacy and more interested in depth, in the emotional archaeology of gender, intimacy, ritual, and reinvention. I noticed that I was no longer speaking only from the raw edge of my wounds. I was speaking from a life built beyond them. That does not mean the wounds disappeared. They didn't. Sometimes I still dreamed about the apartment where Alina found the suitcase. Sometimes a particular kind of late autumn rain could transport me instantly back to that hallway, that open closet, that suspended breath before everything split apart. Trauma stores weather. It stores sounds and fabric and silence. But those memories no longer functioned as prisons. They had become chapters one could revisit without being devoured. More than once I considered reaching out to Alina again, not from unfinished desire, but from curiosity about whether time had softened her life too. We had exchanged brief messages over the years, mostly birthdays and condolences, and once a surprisingly warm note when my essay was published. Eventually we did meet again, almost by accident, at a community arts fundraiser where she was volunteering. She saw me first. I knew from her expression because it moved through surprise into recognition without the old sharpness. She came over holding a clipboard and laughing at the absurdity of our lives crossing in a room full of abstract paintings and cheap wine. She was married by then, not to me, obviously, but to a woman with kind eyes and silver bracelets who joined us after a few minutes and squeezed her shoulder affectionately while listening. That detail alone would have shocked our younger selves into silence. Life had not only changed me, it had changed her too. We talked for nearly half an hour. There was no ghostly tension, no buried hope, just the strange tenderness of people who had once been central to each other's becoming. At one point she said, "I used to think what happened between us ruined me for a while, but now I think it forced me to ask harder questions about who I was too." She smiled toward her wife as she said it. I laughed and told her we had accidentally detonated each other into honesty. She said that sounded right. When we parted, she hugged me. A real hug, warm and uncomplicated. Walking home afterward, I felt lighter than I would have expected. Some endings do not need repair. They need perspective. The years that followed brought achievements I had never imagined during my darkest nights. I was invited onto podcasts, panels, and even a small documentary short about online storytelling and queer self-fashioning. The documentary crew filmed me doing ordinary things, choosing outfits, recording scripts, making tea, laughing with Leora, adjusting lighting, speaking to the camera, walking through fabric markets, touching lace between my fingers with almost devotional attention. Seeing myself through their lens was surreal. I worried they would sensationalize everything, flatten it into a trope, but the final piece was nuanced and human and gentle. One reviewer described me as someone who transformed bridal imagery from a symbol of social expectation into one of self-recognition. I cut that sentence out and stuck it in my journal because it named something I had been living toward for years without fully articulating. There were also losses. June moved abroad for a job and left a lipstick kiss on one of my wine glasses before packing her last box, declaring that if I washed it before she visited again, our friendship was over. Theo's father died, and our whole chosen family rotated casseroles, errands, and grief support like a weird, queer military operation fueled by tea and stubborn devotion. Nina fell spectacularly in love, then disastrously out of it, and I spent many nights on her sofa reminding her that heartbreak is not evidence of foolishness. My mother had a surgery that frightened us all and left her quieter afterward, more willing to reach for tenderness because mortality had thinned some of her defenses. My father finally, one afternoon while fixing a broken shelf in my apartment because apparently acts of service were his last functioning dialect of love, referred to me as my daughter while telling a story about me to the repairman. It slipped out before he could police it. We both froze. He kept screwing the bracket into the wall with excessive focus and muttered, "Hand me that screwdriver." I handed it to him silently with tears burning behind my eyes. Later, after the repairman left, he said, "I'm trying." It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive. I took it. By then, I understood that adulthood is not about getting the perfect versions of people. It is about deciding what imperfect offerings you can live with without betraying yourself. Throughout all of it, the channel remained a strange anchor. Each new script allowed me to take the raw material of life and shape it into something communicable, something that could travel farther than my body ever would. People often assume storytelling is about speaking. But for me, it has always also been about listening to the unsaid layers under memory, listening to what returns, listening to the metaphors your soul keeps choosing when literal language feels too blunt. Why bride? Why veil? Why radiance? Why the repeated image of walking toward rather than away? These symbols persisted because they held emotional truth. They gave structure to feelings that might otherwise dissolve into vague ache. And perhaps that is why so many people found themselves in my stories even when their circumstances were different. Symbols can welcome complexity where labels sometimes fail. One night, after recording for hours, I sat alone in my studio corner, lights still warm, script pages scattered around me, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming gratitude toward the person I had once been in secret. The one sitting before a mirror with trembling lipstick, whispering questions into silence, certain that discovery would mean annihilation. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her everything. Not that it would all be easy. Never that. But that her longing was not shameful. That the dresses were not evidence of corruption. That the future would contain chosen family, laughter, ceremony, love, and rooms where her name would be spoken without hesitation. That one day she would tell stories for a living and women would ask her for advice on eyeliner and existential courage in the same breath. That one day the image of a bride would no longer represent theft or impossibility or secret envy, but homecoming. I cried then, alone and unglamorous, because healing often contains grief for the years you could have lived differently if only someone had told you sooner that you were allowed to exist. Maybe that is why I keep speaking. Because none of us should have to wait as long as we do to hear that permission. If you are still with me now, still listening this far into my story, then you deserve the part people often leave out when they tell transformation tales. You deserve the truth that self-discovery is not a single summit you climb and then live forever above the clouds. It is a practice. There are days I wake up beautiful in my own skin, and days I feel assembled from scraps. There are moments when femininity feels as natural as breath and moments when the world's scrutiny pushes me back into self-consciousness, so hard I have to consciously unknot my shoulders. There are bureaucratic indignities, medical frustrations, online cruelty, and fresh fears that arrive with every new level of visibility. But there is also this morning light on the dresser, where my perfume bottles stand like stained glass. Leora humming in the kitchen while making coffee. My mother texting me photos of blouses, asking which one suits her better. My father asking whether my car tires are okay because winter is coming. Nina calling me from a changing room to ask whether a gown looks expensive or just chaotic. My audience writing to say they finally spoke their truth to a spouse or finally bought the dress or finally stopped thinking their softness made them weak. The life I have now is not perfect. It is real. And real, I learned, is durable in ways fantasy never was. Sometimes people ask why I still use the phrase reluctant groom to radiant bride when it contains a version of me that no longer exists. The answer is because those words tell the arc of my becoming in a way that still matters. I was reluctant, deeply, painfully reluctant, not only about marriage, but about the whole inheritance of manhood I had been told to wear with pride. I walked toward that role because everyone expected me to, and because fear can mimic obedience so well that you start to think they are the same thing. And radiant, for me, does not mean flawless or universally admired. It means lit from within by congruence. It means standing in truth so fully that even your old wounds catch the light differently. It means not dimming your softness to make others feel more secure in their categories. The bride in my story is not merely a bridal figure in silk and lace. She is the self who stopped asking for permission to appear. She is the one who walked out of the hidden room. She is the one who learned that ceremony can belong to anyone brave enough to survive into wholeness. And no one saw her coming, not because she was fake, but because she had been buried under fear for so long that even I mistook her for impossible. I think now about trust, since that was where this story began. I once believed trust meant being chosen and believed and loved by someone else. Now I think trust begins earlier and closer. It begins with not lying to your own ache. It begins with believing that what returns again and again in the privacy of your heart might be trying to save your life rather than ruin it. It begins with letting your own reflection stop being a suspect under interrogation. Had I trusted myself sooner, I might have spared Alina some pain. I might have spared myself years of fracture. But we do not become honest on the schedule hindsight prefers. We become honest when secrecy costs more than truth. That cost nearly broke me, but it also opened the door. So when I sit now in front of the camera and welcome people into feminized bride tales, I am not speaking only from the polished side of survival. I am speaking from the rubble too, from the locked closet, from the rain-soaked hallway, from the cafe where Ariel was first written on a cup, from the studio where I saw myself in ivory and cried like someone being born, from the botanical garden where my chosen people witnessed my becoming, from every ordinary day since then in which I have kept choosing not to disappear. And that, more than anything, is the heart of my story. Not the shock, not the reveal, not the betrayal alone, but the long, difficult, luminous process of becoming someone you can finally welcome home. So if you're standing at the edge of your own truth tonight, if you are afraid of what honesty might cost, if you are still holding your secret like a burning thing you do not know whether to hide or release, let me offer you this from the deepest place I know. You may lose people. You may lose plans. You may lose the version of yourself that kept everyone else comfortable. You may grieve futures that once looked beautiful from the outside. You may walk through seasons so lonely you think no dawn could possibly belong to you again. But if the truth waiting inside you is real, if it returns with tenderness and ache no matter how often you bury it, then following it will not destroy your life. It will reveal which parts were never truly livable to begin with. And on the other side of that revelation, after the tears and fallout and fear, there can be a life that fits. A life where your name feels like yours. A life where love does not require disappearance. A life where your reflection is no longer a battlefield. A life where even the symbols that once hurt you become part of your healing. I know because I lived it. I know because I was the one locking the door, shaking in borrowed silence, praying never to be found. I know because I was the one who got found, got broken, got judged, got abandoned, got remade. I know because I have stood in dresses with grief still pinned inside the seams and learned how to call that beauty anyway. I know because the transformation no one saw coming did not happen in one miraculous moment. It happened every time I chose honesty over numbness, every time I let someone kind witness me, every time I wore what felt true, every time I corrected my name, every time I faced the mirror as an inhabitant instead of an intruder, every time I said yes to the life that asked more of me and gave me back myself in return. And that is why I tell this story again and again, in different shades, with different details, for anyone who needs it. Because somewhere there is still a person sitting in a quiet room believing they are alone in their contradiction, alone in their longing, alone in the impossible beauty that terrifies them. They are not alone. You are not alone. There is a way through. It is not easy. It is not neat. But it is real, and sometimes real is the most radiant thing of all.